Good morning. Can you hear me? Do we need a microphone? Good. My name is Joshua Cole. I'm the acting director of the International Institute for just this semester. And I'm very pleased to welcome you here today to this conference on Indigenous languages. Let me start my remarks simply by citing a few numbers, which the people who are presenting today know very well, but just for the benefit of the public here. There are an estimated 7,000 languages spoken around the world today. And more than half of these languages have no written form. What's more, 96% of these languages are spoken by only 4% of the world's population. You can flip that proportion around. 96% of the world's population speak only 4% of the languages. That disproportion contains a history that's going to be explored today in this conference. A history of violent subjugation, wars on cultures, eradications of cultures. And because it's so important to keep that history present in our minds, as we begin the conference today, I would simply like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. As we work, live, and play here on these territories, we must keep in mind the ongoing effects of colonization, of communities who struggle for their own self-determination. We must keep in mind the legacies of colonial violence and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. I also want to point out something and to thank the conference organizers for presenting and putting together this material today and inviting the presenters. Some of you may know this already. On the 19th of December 2016, the United Nations declared 2019, coming year, as the Year of Indigenous Languages. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues proposed that the University of Michigan host this conference, which has been timed to precede and inform the upcoming UNESCO 2019 year. And I just want everybody to understand and to know that the results of this conference, including the policy recommendations, policy recommendations to promote and revitalize indigenous languages throughout the world, will be reported to the United Nations General Forum after the conclusion of today's events. So let me just again repeat my thanks to Cindy and Howard and Neil and the people who did so much work to organize this conference. This is, many of you may know, the International Institute has 17 different area centers and thematic centers, and this conference presents really the best of what the International Institute can do. Interdisciplinary work on a subject, a complicated subject that has both contemporary and historical relevance that ties together many of the world's regions. I want to thank all the presenters for coming. I look forward to hearing about the results. I unfortunately can't stay for the initial panels, but I'll be back this afternoon to hear the concluding panels. I'm now going to introduce Sally Thomas, who's a professor of linguistics here at the University of Michigan, and she's going to introduce our speakers and the subject matter today. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Joshua. We're going to be hearing 9 speakers today, and their talks are going to cover an enormous geographical range: Northern Asia, India, Middle East and North Africa, South America, Mexico, and New York City. Their topics are divided about equally between surveys of endangered languages in particular regions and case studies of particular languages and language groups: Uyghur, Nahuatl, Quechuan languages, Khoisan languages. You might ask, although Joshua already gave one reason, or major reason, namely the upcoming United Nations year, but you might ask why a conference on indigenous languages and why now? Language loss is accelerating, has been accelerating for well over a century now. As Joshua said, there are about 7,000 languages in the world. Pessimists estimate that up to 90% of those languages will be gone by the end of this century. Optimists estimate that maybe it'll only be about 50%. Even the optimistic prediction is not very cheerful if you're interested in linguistic and cultural diversity. The loss of a language means the loss of the culture it expresses. Here, for instance, is a quotation from Canada's Principles for Revitalization of First Nations Languages. Language is our unique relationship to the Creator, our attitudes, beliefs, values, and fundamental notions of what is truth. Our languages are the cornerstone of who we are as a people. Without our languages, our cultures cannot survive. This sentiment can be found in indigenous cultures all over the world. In a different context, Nelson Mandela once said, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart." And one more quotation, the late, great 20th century linguist Ken Hale said, "When you lose a language, you lose a culture, intellectual wealth, a work of art. It's like dropping a bomb on the Louvre." Loss of a language also means closing a window onto the workings of the human mind. Every one of the world's languages has its own unique structures and meaning representations, and linguists and quite a few other people, but mostly academics, care a lot about determining just how much diversity there is in human language. The urgency of revitalization efforts has become a major theme in small language communities, also in academic linguistics and even in the mass media in the last few decades. Very vigorous efforts are being made by endangered language communities, sometimes with the help of linguists, anthropologists, and other academics. And if you pick a name of some random endangered language and search on the internet, chances are excellent you'll find a website devoted to revitalization of that language. There are now hundreds of websites devoted to revitalization for languages, again, all over the world. Revitalizing an endangered language is not a task for the faint-hearted. It's an extraordinarily complicated process. It requires linguistic skills, organizing ability, a talent for motivating others to carry the cause forward, and other skills and talents as well. I want to make a few general points about language endangerment to set the stage for what you're going to hear for the rest of the day. Causes of language endangerment, not mutually exclusive, of course, but one obvious cause is conquest. There's an interesting comment by David Halberstam in his posthumously published book on the Korean War in 2007. He's talking about the Japanese annexation of Korea, which happened in 1910. He says they wanted to obliterate Korean culture, starting with the language. The official language of Korea was proclaimed to be Japanese. In schools, lessons were to be taught in Japanese. The Japanese language textbook was called the Mother Tongue Reader. Koreans were to take Japanese names. They didn't make much progress in getting rid of the Korean language. There were millions of Korean speakers, and they liked their language. Perhaps if there had been more time, rather than just 35 years, they might have made some progress. But that's one thing conquest can do. And of course, if the language doesn't have millions of speakers, it's much easier to get rid of a minority language if the conquering people want to. Another cause, well, economic pressures fit in with conquest and language politics, but language politics in general, including in this country, the melting pot ideology, according to which if you're not speaking English, you're not a real American. You must assimilate to American culture. One thing this led to in the 19th century and early 20th century, first half of the 20th century actually, was the boarding schools, the infamous boarding schools where indigenous children were forced to attend and were beaten for speaking their languages. There's Marie Smith Jones, who was the last speaker of Eyak, an Alaskan indigenous language, said in 1998, "Sometimes I could just kick myself for not teaching my children the language. When I was in school, we were beaten for speaking our language. They wanted to make us ashamed. I have 17 and 18-year-old kids coming to me crying because the elders in their tribes will not teach them their own language." I have found this in my own field work in northwestern Montana on the Flathead Reservation. A couple of decades ago, more than 2 decades ago, one of the elders I'd worked with for a long time, Harriet Whitworth, who had gone to the boarding schools, said this when I asked her if she had raised any of her numerous children to speak Salish, her language. She said, "No, I did not. I didn't want them to go through what I went through." And I asked her, if you had it to do all over again now, would you do it differently? And she said, "Yes, of course, but it's too late." Another cause, in some ways maybe the most important cause, because even most conquerors don't try all that hard to eradicate the languages of the people they've conquered, but a powerful cause is attitudes of the dominant language groups, but also attitudes of the endangered language communities, of the communities of minority languages that are becoming endangered. Some immigrant languages in this country, other than English, were spoken for quite a while, a few still are, and particularly in rural areas, also New York City, which we'll hear more about today, and in the Great Plains, for instance. And the daughter of Swedish immigrants said once, talking to a reporter, or a linguist or an anthropologist, somebody like that, "Father came from the island of Gotland and mother from Östergötland. Thus they had different dialects. When we people spoke, the other people laughed at us, so we went over to English." If you've got bilinguals in an immigrant community, or for that matter, an indigenous community, because I know of at least one native language in this country where that also happened, and the young people are making mistakes or speaking a different dialect and get laughed at for it, they've got another language. They just switch. Attitudes can change. Attitudes of dominant group members and attitudes of minority group members. There's an interesting contrast between the view of former French President Jacques Chirac on minority communities in France in 1999 when he was president, and in 2008 after his presidency when he was founding or establishing a foundation to promote diversity. In 1999, he was reported this way: "The president does not wish to take the initiative for a revision of the Constitution that would violate the basic principles of our republic." That is, he was against doing what the prime minister wanted him to do, to modify the Constitution to give even limited official recognition to France's 7 regional languages. That was 1999. Fast forward to 2008, when he's establishing the Chirac Foundation. "We must place culture and cultural diversity at the heart of the human adventure. Do we want an impoverished world, one that only preserves what is profitable in the short term? Personally, I reject that idea. UNESCO should devise ways of avoiding the disappearance of humanity's priceless linguistic heritage." He's not specifically talking about France, but presumably he was including regional languages in France as well. A less discussed cause of endangerment is dialect loss through standardization. If you want to revitalize your endangered language and get it into the educational system, you're going to have to do some standardization, and that requires making choices, and if there's dialect variation, you're going to have to choose this dialect feature over that dialect feature. And because even dialects, as well as whole languages, are very often a crucial part of people's identity, this can cause dissension in the minority language group. And it's linked to purism. A citizen of the Dakota tribe, John Hunt Peacock, commented about purism in 2010. He said, he objected to, quote, "an insistence on the part of some fluent-speaking traditionalists that indigenous languages can or should be spoken only one way. Dakota speakers whom I have met in learning the language myself are sometimes less than tolerant of regional dialect differences. Of absolutely no survival value to my ancestors, the European Romantic ideal of oral language purity has been adopted by contemporary indigenous language purists. So those are some of the things that promote endangerment. You might ask, is there anything that doesn't promote endangerment? Well, lack of conquest, lack of economic pressures, adverse language politics, melting pot ideology, and negative attitudes, that'd help. It also helps if all community members, including children, speak the language and in multiple domains, not just at home. If there's official government support, including, crucially, in the educational system as a medium of instruction, not just as like a foreign language to be learned a couple hours a week. Economic power helps. Casinos on reservations in this country are helping support revitalization programs. They bring their own problems, but they definitely bring money. Having lots of speakers, both rural and urban, helps. And so does the relative isolation of a minority language community. Pennsylvania Dutch, actually Pennsylvania German, still is robust in a few areas in the Midwest, including one community in Michigan, partly because they have their own religion and they have kept themselves separate from the larger society. They know English, but they still speak Pennsylvania German. Southern Sami in Norway and Sweden. Similarly, the San of Botswana, until the government moved them out of the Kalahari Desert, and then they weren't isolated anymore and their language started to go. No community can succeed in maintaining its heritage, minority community, in maintaining its heritage culture and heritage language unless it has a very strong motivation to do so. And as more or less a corollary to that, revitalization cannot be done by linguists or anthropologists or any other academics. It can only be done by communities. Academics can help if they're asked to, if they're welcome in the community, because they can provide tools, they can provide documentation. You can preserve knowledge of the language even if you lose the last speaker. Bob Rankin was a linguist who specialized in Siouan languages spoken on the Great Plains of this country. And one of the languages he had documented before the last speakers were gone was Ka. And in a 2014 obituary, when Bob had died, Kaw tribal member Jim Pepper Henry said this. He said, "If it wasn't for his work, we wouldn't have our language. He single-handed preserved our language. You can't put a price on something like that." Preservation is not revitalization. That's one of the reasons I say linguists and other academics can't do revitalization. The Tlingit oral historians Nora Marks Dauenhauer and Richard Dauenhauer said about 20 years ago, they said, "Preservation is what we do to berries in jam jars and salmon in cans. Preserved foods are different from thriving berry patches and surging runs of salmon, and dictionaries are not the same as speech. Books and recordings can preserve languages, but only people and communities can keep them alive." Thank you.